بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق وخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدر مقداره العظيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today I would like to talk about the best method for learning classical Arabic by examining different approaches, namely developing speaking as a skill versus understanding classical texts. And I would put forth that before learning Arabic, it's necessary to have a tangible goal in learning the language. For example, do you want to travel overseas? Do you want to be able to speak Arabic with family and friends? Would you like to be able to access Arabic media and newscasts? Or is your main goal to learn how to understand the Quran and read Islamic texts? All of these goals require a different skill set, so it's important to see what your highest priority is, especially if you are learning in a part-time online program, which is much different than if you're going overseas and learning in an intensive program. If you're learning part-time, the program must be optimized to help you achieve your goals because there's going to be less hours. Whereas if you're going overseas to study for a couple of years intensively, it doesn't need to necessarily be optimized to such an extent. Or to state this very clearly, if you want to learn to understand the Quran in Islamic texts, then the most important linguistic skill to achieve that goal is comprehension for reading and listening, along with the applied grammar foundation that is necessary to facilitate that. And I kind of mentioned the word grammar here, which is a little bit of a boogeyman for some people, where there's this sort of idea that maybe we should just leave grammar because it's difficult. Or for example, I'm a native speaker of the English language, and I don't know anything about grammar, but yet I speak English fluently. So why would we even need it in the first place? Why is it even necessary? I think that in general, most people do not even know the purpose of grammar. They think that it's just simply a list of rules. But in reality, grammar is basically a tool or a way of understanding the mechanics of how a language actually works. Okay, so it does take some effort, but we're not really talking about theoretical grammar here or list of rules, but rather we're talking about applied practice, where you can read books that are made or written for non-native speakers of Arabic who want to understand the Quran and understand Islamic text. Some of the books that come to mind are Qasas al-Nabiyyin, where even going through the first couple of volumes, you're likely to learn about 70% of the vocabulary in the Quran. Another text the person might read would be Zad al-Talibin, the provisions of the seeker, where even from the beginning of the text, all of the examples are directly from hadith literature, starting at simple sentences and building up towards more complicated sentences as you go through the book, which is much different than, for example, learning with the most commonly used book in American universities, Al-Kitab fi Ta'allum al-Arabiya, where beginning students are learning terms for things like the United Nations and bilateral government relations and things like that. So when we're talking about grammar, we're talking about applied grammar on relevant books where you can simultaneously gain Quranic vocabulary and even in general, the terminology that scholars use across the various disciplines of the Islamic sciences, and using grammar as a tool to understand how and why the language means what it does. If this is the way that grammar is being approached, then it is very much worth the effort in undertaking it. And it's not an impossible task. If someone were to tell you that you could make millions of dollars by putting in a little bit of effort, nearly anybody would bend over backwards for the dunya. But for the deen, the knowledge in any Islamic science, or particularly the sciences of the Arabic language, that knowledge and application also needs to be practiced and developed, just like you would for any other art, skill, or craft. So my advice for anyone who's seeking to find a language course is to be very to beware and like be very careful about any sort of gimmicky approach that seeks to find a shortcut to such an extent that it sounds good at first. Don't learn grammar. Like you don't know it for your own native language and you speak fine. Just get a book with the most commonly used Arabic words and memorize the vocabulary like a phone book. Anytime that you sort of take a reductionist approach and leave out essential components of language, you're not going to achieve the desired results of understanding the Quran. So when we're talking about grammar, it's not just rules upon rules upon rules, and it's not leaving it completely, but rather it's sort of striking a balance, not watering things down, but at the same time, it should be made accessible and attainable for anyone who's willing to put in some effort. So I think that when assessing any method for learning classical Arabic, it's important to point out that even though speaking Arabic is beneficial, and there are many, really speaking, there's many benefits of it. However, it's not a prerequisite to learn classical Arabic. The proof for that is if you look in many countries or many lands that are non-Arabic lands that still produce highly trained ulama and scholars. Some of these great ulama in non-Arab lands can accurately read difficult text in all of the Islamic sciences, even if they don't have any speaking fluency or sort of rusty skills or broken Arabic when they try to speak. On the other hand, even native speakers of the Arabic language, if they don't have training in the Islamic sciences and training specifically in the science of the Arabic language, they would not be able to even understand these specialized texts, even though their native language is Arabic, and even though that these texts are the key to understanding the Quran at a deeper level. So to understand why it's not enough to simply learn Arabic in the general sense, we must understand that broadly speaking, there are three different types of Arabic. The first type is classical Arabic. This is the language that was spoken by the ancient Arabs. It was spoken until approximately 150 years after Hijrah. And due to language evolution, it started to change to such an extent that the rules of the language needed to be preserved and established in order to let future generations understand the Quran. So these are the efforts of pioneering scholars like Sibawayh, for example, who took linguistic proofs, even from the Bedouins of his time, that were the closest speakers to the ancient Arabs. Okay, so classical Arabic was actually a language that was spoken as a native tongue. And at that time, there was no need to learn the rules. Just like for whatever native language you may speak, whether English or otherwise, there's no need for you to know what an adjective is or an adverb is or a resumptive pronoun is, for example, to be able to speak the language properly. You would be able to use all of the things perfectly in practice without knowing the terminology. However, when the language started to change, there had to be something in place to preserve the language. Okay, so after approximately 150 years after Hijrah, classical Arabic was no longer spoken as a native language, although scholars continued to write according to that style in books. The second type of Arabic is what's called modern standard Arabic. Okay, so these first two, they're both called Fusha, generally speaking, but classical Arabic at times is referred to Fusha al-Turath, the classical Arabic, whereas modern standard Arabic is Fusha al-Asr. And this became sort of in use around the mid-19th century, using the core of classical Arabic, but changes in register, changes in style, changes in vocabulary, but roughly speaking, an outgrowth of classical Arabic. Now, modern standard Arabic is not used as a language that people communicate with in their daily lives. It's mostly used in media broadcast. It may be used in conferences where there's Arabs from many different parts of the world. Many Islamic scholars teach their lessons in modern standard Arabic, but it's not spoken in everyday life. It's mostly a written language and used in highly formal situations. However, as a foreigner learning Arabic, it is not uncommon for foreigners to speak to people using modern standard Arabic, although the people that they're talking to may not respond back in modern standard Arabic, which brings us to the third type of Arabic, which is the colloquial Arabic dialects. These are this is the native Arabic that speakers use, and these colloquial Arabic dialects differ from region to region. For example, there are language continuums. The dialect in Morocco is similar to dialects in Algeria or Tunisia because they're in the same general area. And then starting around the border between Libya and Egypt, it shifts from the Western Arab dialects to the Eastern Arab dialects. And there's other dialects in that family, such as Egyptian Arabic, or Levantine Arabic, or Hijazi Arabic, or Iraqi Arabic. This is the language that Arabs speak on a day-to-day basis. And these colloquial Arabic dialects are not written, but rather it's a spoken language. And when native Arabic speakers want to write, they go back to modern standard Arabic. So when we're looking at these three varieties of Arabic, we can look at linguistic skills and how these linguistic skills apply to those Arabic varieties. The four linguistic skills are reading, writing, speaking, and listening. So for classical Arabic, it's mostly a textual language today. So it's relevant to learn reading skills, to read text. It's also relevant to develop listening skills. For example, listening to the Quran as it's being recited. And even one may say developing writing skills, which is not as common, but it's still possible for non-Arabs to develop writing skills in classical Arabic and write books in that style. The second type of Arabic, modern standard Arabic, even though this is not the variety of Arabic that native speakers of Arabic actually use on a day-to-day basis, is still relevant to learn all four skills: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Whereas for the colloquial Arabic dialects, it's not a written language other than, for example, billboards or text messages or other informal environments. So it's mainly consists of speaking and listening only. Okay. So in looking at this, especially if one's getting started, one might feel, I don't want to limit myself to any of these things. I would really love to master all of these varieties of Arabic and learn the four linguistic skills as much as possible as applied to classical Arabic, modern standard Arabic, and also to any of the Arabic dialects like Moroccan Arabic or Egyptian Arabic. However, it's necessary to set reasonable goals in your language learning because it takes a long time to master everything. For example, in the United States, the Foreign Service Institute trains diplomats with modern standard Arabic and colloquial Arabic. You can go online and read about this. There's even in the public domain textbooks, 3 volumes of textbooks for modern standard Arabic, and they have other textbooks like a course in Hijazi Arabic using the audiolingual method. But basically, they would train their diplomats with 2,200 classroom hours over 88 intensive weeks. Okay, the idea is after these 88 weeks of just like full-on training all day long in Arabic, that they'll be very fluent in the language. But now if we try to sort of take that number of hours and sort of convert it to online studies or any sort of part-time studies for just 3 hours per week, it would actually take 14 years to reach that same amount of hours. 14 years to reach 2,200 hours if you're doing it just for 3 hours a week. And you also have to factor into that the FSI training does not even include any training in classical Arabic, other than perhaps little snippets here and there, and it doesn't have any training in the subject matter of the Islamic sciences. So, you know, we're looking at perhaps complete fluency under this time frame, but even if we were talking about lesser fluency, you know, there's 2 main scales in order to measure fluency. One is called the CEFR scale, which stands for the Common European Framework of References for Languages. And the other one, that's mainly used in Europe, as the name of, kind of signifies, the CEFR, The other scale is ACTFL, which is American Council for the Teaching of Foreign Languages. So if one wanted to only gain, let's say, B1 fluency or intermediate high fluency on the ACTFL scale, it could potentially take less time than that. But even if you're aiming for, not complete fluency, but some level of fluency, it needs to be assessed as to how the speaking fluency is actually going to help you in order to access Islamic text. For example, if someone were to say a sentence using a textbook for modern standard Arabic, like في عطلة آخر الأسبوع أحب أن ألعب كرة القدم مع أصدقائي في الحديقة. Like, I want to play soccer with my friends on the weekend, or something like that. Like, how is learning this vocabulary and these sentence structures really going to help you to get to the understanding of the Quran? Because the Quran is much more difficult language. It's written in a not written, but it's the kalam of Allah. It's revealed in a much different style. It's a linguistic miracle. So a lot of language learners and even teachers, they'll sort of take this approach that, well, learning about playing soccer and going to the club and whatever else in these modern standard Arabic textbooks, that Arabic is easier. So that the easier Arabic needs to be learned before moving on to more advanced Arabic. And really speaking, in my view, it's a huge mistake. This idea that first we learn beginner Arabic, then beginner high Arabic, then intermediate low Arabic until we get to advanced Arabic. Because when you really think about it, how relevant all of these things are, there are some things in beginning Arabic that are extremely relevant to classical Arabic. And there's some things in advanced Arabic that are extremely relevant to classical Arabic. But you can also flip it and say, there are some things in beginning Arabic which are completely irrelevant, or not completely irrelevant, but much less relevant to classical Arabic, just as there's advanced things that are much less relevant. So it's like, why flush out all the possibilities for beginning Arabic when some of those things are not directly applicable or not used more broadly, and just go from beginner to intermediate to advanced? One, instead, you could take a different approach and first focus on core Arabic by looking at the most important aspects of how the Arabic language works, and the glue for the framework of how we can understand the language, regardless of whether it's beginning or advanced, but just the most important things first, the core of the language, and then after gaining the core, going from more relevant to less relevant aspects. Of course, doing that approach, there are some beginning things that you need to preload up front, but the idea is not to go from beginning to advanced, but to go from most relevant to things that are less relevant. So when we're looking at grammar and understanding the language, some of these core concepts include things like word order, agreements between words, whether it's the mawsuf and sifa, the describing words for the ism, or agreement between the doer of the verb, the subject of a verbal sentence and the verb. Looking at things like case endings and grammatical inflection. How does putting different case endings at the end of a word, how does it help to make meanings less ambiguous? What about things like the discussion of mu'rab versus mabni? How some words change because they're ambiguous, and these endings help to provide clarity to the role of the word in the sentence, whereas other words that are mabni, that have static endings, are able to convey multiple meanings without that ambiguity. Other core issues are things like, how are words derived from root letters, which is typically 3 root letters? How then, when deriving those words, how do the patterns affect the meaning? These are all foundational topics, and they're needed to understand the Quran properly. But unfortunately, even though many of these topics are very essential to understanding the core of how the language works, many programs deem these topics to be too difficult for beginners, and they wait years to explain them, literally years to explain them, which leaves students who want to learn Arabic specifically for the purpose of learning the Quran and Islamic texts, it leaves them very frustrated. Therefore, I would say that for part-time Arabic studies online, just given how long it takes to master every single aspect of the Arabic language, it's necessary to focus on only one variety of Arabic. If you want to learn classical Arabic to understand the Quran and read Islamic text, focus on that. If you want to learn how to speak modern standard Arabic fluently, focus on that. If you want to learn how to communicate in an Arabic dialect like Hijazi Arabic or Moroccan Arabic, get an online tutor and some textbooks and focus on that. But if you're kind of spreading yourself too thin across all of these different varieties of language, you're basically dabbling in every variety without gaining a firm mastery of anything. You're not gaining really any skills that you can learn. So in a part-time environment, it just simply doesn't make sense to spread yourself that thin and not make any real progress in any specific area. Now, let's say, for example, on the other hand, a person was studying intensively overseas in an institute for learning Arabic for a year or two. Then when you're studying in the classroom for 3 or 4 hours a day, studying multiple hours at night, dealing with native Arabic speakers throughout the day as you go through life, it's very possible to focus on multiple varieties at the same time. And in that situation, it might actually be the ideal path. However, we're not talking about simply going overseas and doing intensive studies like that. When we're dealing with part-time studies, we can't expect the same teaching methods to work, but rather it requires an optimized course of study. And I would go as far to say that speaking is not a prerequisite to learn classical Arabic. Nothing wrong with speaking, especially if you're in an intensive environment, but it's not a prerequisite to learn classical Arabic. And if you're setting it up that I have to learn it first, you're basically sort of taking the long way to get to your destination. Hopefully, you'll stay on course and eventually you'll get to your destination, even if it takes longer. But what we find is that many students, when they don't see the progress that they want in learning classical Arabic and understanding the Quran, they feel like this language is too difficult for me. I need to give up. I've even seen students who have studied in American universities for 3 years or 4 years, straight A's in their classes. And for those of you who are sort of unaware of what this entails to study Arabic at the university for 3 or 4 years, it means that each semester, you're typically taking one class in Arabic that is for 3 to 5 hours of classroom time per week, along with other subjects. Although there are some Arabic programs in universities are more intensive, this is typically, what you'll find. So spending 3 to 5 hours a week in class for 4 years and you can't understand the Quran, this is not a problem with the student. The student at the end of this is able to hold conversations in modern standard Arabic, but they're not able to understand the Quran. If they go and hang out with their friends or they try to travel overseas, they can't necessarily even understand the colloquial Arabic that people are speaking in the dialects. They're kind of getting an introduction to everything, which is helpful. Having this 3 or 4 years is definitely going to make learning classical Arabic easier for them afterwards, but still they have to start, learning it through traditional methods at some point. Okay. So it's really like learning speaking first when you're in a part-time environment. It's like taking the scenic route. Rather, what you want to do is take the optimized method in order to understand the Quran and Islamic text in the shortest time possible without watering down anything. So what then is actually needed to learn classical Arabic? First of all, one must gain reading skills for comprehension and to increase relevant vocabulary. Okay, so starting with these books like Qasas al-Nabiyyin or Zad al-Talibin that we mentioned previously in this lesson, or then moving on to more authentic-like materials, to easier tafasir, or to short mutun, concise text in the Islamic sciences, where due to their brevity, one doesn't have to spend a lot of time looking words up. Okay. In order to do this, one must learn the core grammar concepts and directly utilize those concepts with applied practice in texts. We're not talking about learning rules upon rules, but learning how the language actually works and using the grammar as a tool to understand why we're gaining the meaning from the text that is the intended meaning. Okay, so eventually this method, it should lead to the ability to accurately read unvoweled Arabic text with the help of a dictionary. So by learning grammar in an applied environment through reading real books, you're gaining vocabulary along the way. But of course, the Arabic language is a very deep and rich language. So at some point, you will have the ability to analyze, Arabic text, but you still need to use the dictionary and learn to learn additional vocabulary. Okay. One of the things also that can help at that point in learning more vocabulary is to listen to audio lectures of scholars, so that you're not constantly looking up words in the dictionary, but that you're learning words from context and hearing them pronounced properly by in the audio lectures by the Islamic scholars. So also, this is going to give you the benefit of being able to apply the grammar to the Quran, to be able to understand its deeper meaning and to access tafsir literature. So as you can see, this is a much different skill set than speaking modern standard Arabic fluently, or listening to newscasts and reading the newspaper fluently, or even learning an Arabic dialect to speak with family and friends, or to go traveling. Nothing wrong with those goals, but if you're in a part-time learning environment and you simply don't have enough time to master all of these things up front, my advice is to pick one thing and to focus on it and to learn it well. So one needs to see what the main goal is and focus on that goal to achieve real results in the fastest way possible. So even if at the end of one's studies, one wants to, at some point, have a comprehensive understanding of classical Arabic, modern standard Arabic, and a colloquial dialect, it's better to gain proficiency in one area first before spreading oneself too thin. So for example, if one already has a plan in place to leave for intensive studies overseas, maybe it's in a few months and you already have your plane ticket in hand, it would make a lot of sense to focus first on speaking modern standard Arabic, because it's directly applicable to one's current situation, and one would need to have that for studies overseas. But on the other hand, let's say one wants to learn how to understand the Quran and Islamic texts, and speaking at this point is something that would sort of be nice to have, or maybe at some point in the future, whether it's in 2 years or 3 years, or I don't know when, but at some point, traveling overseas is something that a person would want to do. If that's the situation the person's in, it would make more sense to take the direct route of learning classical Arabic right away. And then, after gaining some degree of competency in classical Arabic, moving on to speaking skills at a later time. In other words, it should be a step-by-step process where your personal goals are taken into consideration. And that's why I would advocate that learning how to speak modern standard Arabic is not the direct method for gaining fluency in reading Islamic texts. Rather, the methodology used for classical Arabic should focus on textual analysis and reading practice to understand the work of scholars, because no amount of speaking practice can substitute for that. So specifically, if we're talking about part-time online studies, it should not be assumed that a teaching method that works very well for intensive study overseas is likewise going to work in a completely different learning environment online. Simply put, if you want to learn classical Arabic, then that's what you should study directly, without making unnecessary obstacles for yourself, without saying, I need to learn how to speak Arabic fluently first. Because really speaking, many people go for the speaking method and they don't always achieve that goal. Some of them give up before learning how to speak fluently, and then they think Arabic is too hard, where you can go directly into learning classical Arabic. You can go directly into it. And if you have time and energy to do speaking as well, even better. But my sincere advice for part-time learners is to choose whichever goal is most important for you, and then to focus on that goal to achieve real and tangible results. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.